So I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Matthew Tschabold, whom I have known for a very long time. I first remember meeting Matt back in 1995 when I was 9 years old, and my big brother was on a team of gifted children who represented the state of Oregon at the Odyssey of the Mind World Finals in Knoxville, Tennessee. And Matt was on the team with my big brother, and I'll always remember him being nice to me as I tagged along as a little brother. In addition to being a once gifted child, Matt has a heart for service. He, after graduating from Oregon State University, served promoting democracy and doing planning in the Republic of North Macedonia as a Peace Corps volunteer. He grew up stateside, got his master's degree in urban planning from New York University, and then has spent the last 8 years as the policy and planning manager for the Portland Housing Bureau. Very recently, he was handpicked to be a policy and planning advisor for Governor Kotek's Housing and Homelessness Initiative. So please join me in giving a warm Rotary welcome to Matthew Tschabold.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Luke, thanks for the warm welcome, and thank you all for having me here today. As Lucas mentioned, I'm with Governor Kotek's office. I'm with the Housing and Homelessness team in our office, and so I'm hoping today, to have a conversation. I hope it could be conversational. I want to take advantage of having all of the community leaders here in the room. But I also want to give you a sense of the governor's priorities around housing and homelessness, the actions that she has taken, and the actions we've taken in the first nearly 100 days of her being in office, and the roadmap that we're establishing to try to have a substantial impact on affordable housing production, market rate housing production, and homelessness in the state of Oregon. So, and trying to watch the time also, so we can have some time for discussion at the end. So I guess before I jump into it, just to give you a sense of how the governor is approaching her administration. She is focused on 3 priority areas. So, obviously it's a big state government. There are a lot of departments working on a lot of different issues. For her, she has 3 core initiatives, and she's structured her office a bit unique compared to previous administrations. So one is housing and homelessness, one is education, and the other is behavioral health. And so for those 3 initiative areas, she's bringing on multi-member teams. Traditionally in the governor's office, they appoint a single policy advisor for a particular issue area. But given that there's such a high priority around these 3 initiatives for the governor and for Oregonians, she's putting together multi-member teams within her office. So I'm part of the Housing and Homelessness Initiative team. My colleague Taylor Smiley-Wolf is the director of the initiative. I'm the senior policy advisor, and we're actually in the process of bringing on a 3rd team member so we can really scale up our efforts across the state around housing and homelessness. So, just I guess a quick contextual overview. Two major issues really that we're trying to unpack and get into. And obviously the first one is homelessness. It's a major issue in communities across the state of Oregon. Urban communities, rural communities, coastal communities. Since 2017, there's been a 63% increase in unsheltered homelessness, or homelessness overall in Oregon. And just so we're using some common language, homelessness, you can be unsheltered, literally living on the street, literally living outside of structures. You can be doubled up. My father experienced doubled up homelessness when he was a young adult. That's living in your car, living in homes with friends and family. You can be highly just unstable, so moving from physical sleeping place to physical sleeping place. You can think of living in motels or living in what we would call in the industry transitional housing or permanent supportive housing. So it's a significant issue. I know you all have it in your community, and there's just been a fairly dramatic increase since 2017. And that's led to some of the direct actions around the executive orders that I'll chat a little bit about today. The second is a massive shortage in housing across the state of Oregon. So there was some recent legislation in 2019 that directed the state and local governments to start doing some work around something called the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. It directed local governments to start to put together essentially local housing plans. So identifying what the needs for housing were in their communities, what they will be projected into the future, and identify strategies to increase overall supply. So through that, the state worked with Echo Northwest and some other outside experts to determine what the shortage was in Oregon today. And it's 140,000 units across the state. We'll kind of unpack that a bit more because it's even starker when you think about the projected need for housing over the next 20 years. So those are kind of the two big issues. I want to unpack them each a little bit, talk about the governor's initial framework for how to respond to those, and then make sure that I've got time to answer questions as well. So on the homelessness front, in 2022, this statewide count, it's not super accurate, but it's the best we've got, that showed that there were 18,000 individuals in Oregon that were experiencing homelessness. And 62 of those were literally homeless, so literally unsheltered. It's a federal definition, out, living on the streets. It's the Oregonians we see all around us in our communities. We are the 4th highest in the country for unsheltered homelessness, and we are the worst when it comes to families with children. So we've got a lot of work to do. The state breaks there's a designation, hopefully some of you are involved, there's something called continuums of care. These are really federal designations of regional stakeholders and partners, governments, nonprofits, businesses. They come together, they do planning work around federal money, they implement services to address homelessness. The state, because those designations exist, the state also flows money to those. So 4 of the 8 regions, there's 8 of them in the state of Oregon, 4 of them, plus Metro, had an increase of over 50% between 2017 and 2022. So a dramatic increase. And this is not limited to the metro area. It's not just an urban issue. There are southern Oregon counties, eastern Oregon counties, and coastal counties that have seen this kind of increase. On the housing shortage side, so we have a 140,000 unit deficit. There's a projected need of over 440,000 housing units over the next 20 years. That means we would need to produce 36,000 units per year in Oregon to address the current deficit and make progress toward the 20-year target over the next 10 years. So if we want to be able to make progress, make up what we need to make up, we need to produce 36,000 units a year. It's an ambitious goal that the governor has set, and it's also an 80% increase over current production levels. So the most recent 5-year average for housing production in the state of Oregon was about 20,000 units a year. So being able to increase that 80% at a time when inflation is significant, I would say it's extremely significant in the housing development sector, when cost of capital, cost of debt is higher than it's been in probably at least a decade, if not more. So we've got significant headwinds that we're facing, but we have a priority of building units and supporting the industry to try and ramp up production, but we do have challenges that we'll need to navigate ahead. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And I'll also just mention that half the need is below 80% of the median income. And it's a federal designation. They do some analysis with the census data to determine what the median income is for different areas of the state. I think what's important to know is that for the most part, housing, particularly rental housing, below, I'd say about 50% of the median income, it doesn't pencil. It is extremely hard to develop at that price point because of the cost of land, the cost of debt and equity, the cost of construction, the returns aren't there. And so usually housing below 50, 60% of the median income, depending on the community, it's going to require some level of either direct subsidy or indirect subsidy to the builder themselves. And if that's where 50% of our need is, we've got to have a significant role that the state needs to play in that regard. This table is a bit small. I hope folks can see it. I do want to walk through it because I think it's important, and I think it demonstrates a little bit about what I was talking about with regard to where the need is. It helps us tackle the question about what should the state's role be. That's a question we're going to be taking a hard look at over this year with something we'll talk about later around the Housing Production Advisory Council. So basically how to read the chart is in the yellow shaded box. It is demonstrating the existing underproduction in the state of Oregon. So if you were to look at the bottom numbers, the summary numbers, there's currently we're short 110,000 units for people that live in existing housing. Essentially, they're paying more than they can afford for housing right now. And then we're short about another 30,000 units for people that are experiencing homelessness. So to move folks into housing, we need housing to move them into, and we don't want to create, issues with regard to the supply and demand balance. And so in total, we need 140,000 units as a result of our underproduction, as well as our housing for people experiencing homelessness. I think that chart naturally, for people who are not in the housing industry, in the real estate industry, you can ask the question, we're all people in this 140,000. It's the natural vacancy rate that occurs in the marketplace. We have an extremely tight vacancy rate in certain areas of the state. A healthy vacancy rate in the rental market, probably depending on who you ask, is somewhere closer to 4 to 7%. And it's as tight as 2 to 3% in some areas. Effectively, no vacancy except for your turnover. And that creates supply and demand issues, which again increases the price of housing, which creates this affordability issue that we're struggling with as a state. Separately, to the left of the yellow shading, the yellow box, is the projected need. So that is, you see all the data sets up there that were used, but that is what the projected need is over the next 20 years. And you can see it broken out by income bracket there, if you're interested in that. And so it's 443,000 units. So based on projected population growth, projected in-migration and out-migration, that's the estimate we need to reduce over 20 years. So, got a significant crisis around people experiencing homelessness, a significant shortage of housing. And so when the governor first came into office, she took immediate action to implement her recommended budget, as well as 3 executive orders to address to start to have an impact on both homelessness and housing production. And I'd like to walk you through those today. Oh, also, please feel free to interrupt if there's any questions. Okay, great.
When you talk about the people who are living in units that are not able to afford, so they're above the amount that they should be paying, so they're not able to afford that unit, basically, why isn't there, or is there a plan in this to subsidize those people already in those units as opposed to building more affordable units? Why not make the units they're in more affordable?
That's a good question. I think it's complicated. I think the major drivers that I would mention is, I think folks are probably familiar with the Section 8 program. It's also called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's a federal program to help to subsidize housing costs, either by giving vouchers directly to individuals to help them pay their rent, or I think a less well-known version is where you actually tie a voucher to a particular housing unit somewhere in the state, and regardless of who's living there, you get subsidized rent as long as you income qualify. I think the challenge is, while there have been some gains in terms of additional investment in the voucher program in kind of recent years, effectively it hasn't grown much since the 90s. And so,
is that because of budget allocations?
Yeah, at the federal level, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's a federal program. And so I think one of the things that we're experiencing from my perspective at the state level and in our communities is because the federal investment in housing assistance, rental assistance vouchers has not grown proportionate to, I would say, the population growth in the United States, as well as the need. Local communities in the state are having to kind of pick up the tab and figure out solutions. So I think that's one part of the answer to your question. And the second is, I mean, both are done. So the state does provide some rental assistance and does finance the development of a lot of housing around the state. Yes, sir.
It's probably on the last chart you have, but I was trying to reconcile in my brain, that's always a tough thing, but you said there were 18,000 approximate homeless. So those are families, so they need one place to stay, or couples, so the number is smaller. So, but you said there's 140,000 unit shortage. So how does that work? There's 18,000 homeless, not all of them, not each one of those individually needs a house. So how do you line those up?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it is a methodology that was developed by certified smart people and economists. But essentially, it is estimating the number of people who are paying dramatically more for their housing costs than they can afford. And that is leading to, let me take a step back to answer your question. I think you can really think about homelessness, there's kind of three circumstances where people tend to experience homelessness. I don't want to generalize too much, but three circumstances where people are experiencing homelessness in Oregon. One is a temporary economic event, right? So people live paycheck to paycheck. They have a job loss, they have an unexpected household expense or unexpected healthcare expense. And it leads them to need some temporary assistance, and if they're not able to access that assistance, they can lose their housing and will experience some homelessness. Second, people experiencing some longer-term behavioral health, addiction, mental health event where they need both housing and stabilization services. And then the third is natural disaster-related wildfire. We experience that in Oregon, where you physically lose your home because of flood, of wildfire, something like that. So the shortage, the 140,000 unit shortage, is an estimation of the number of housing units we need in Oregon to lower the rent, the cost of housing to a point where people are not so vulnerably housed, where a single economic event will push them into homelessness. It is that in the general marketplace, the vacancy rate for, like using rental housing specifically, the vacancy rate for rental housing is effectively zero, where to have a healthy housing market, you need it closer to 4 to 6, 4 to 7%, which creates some balance in terms of what people are paying. And we just effectively have as I mentioned, effectively have a no vacancy rate in many communities, and it's just turnover. And so that 140,000 units is what is projected that it could be, snap our fingers, could instantly be in Oregon if we create housing stability for households that are on the risk of homelessness, but not there yet. I think that's the best way I can describe it without getting too deep into
Other builders / developers, are there incentive programs in place or will be in place to build lower cost units?
Yeah,
That's all I ever see around here is, starting at $700,000, $800,000. So
that's a great question. I'm going to answer that in a few slides, and you can go on to that one.
That's a question with regards to the first slide, which indicated that there was, a 68% increase in homelessness over the last 6 years. Big question mark there is just really, how did that happen? And it doesn't do us any good to keep building homes for homeless people if we're not doing something to stop the leak. Can you touch on that a little bit? And then my second question is with regards to this slide in particular. The underproduction are any of those numbers as a result of people that that could afford housing if they had one to buy?
So interesting question. On the first question, I think we've seen across the United States both a dramatic increase in addiction and mental health issues. Addiction and mental health issues, as well as single point in time economic events, job loss, or a health event or something like that push people into homelessness. And so those numbers have just dramatically increased. Where
Over just the last 6 years, though?
Yeah, particularly on the West Coast, particularly in Oregon.
Has anybody been able to identify the reasons for that, though?
It's people's housing costs that are going up faster than their incomes. It is people who've lost their jobs. It's people who have experienced a financial event and they can't afford to live in their housing. And one of the drivers also, at least from the governor's perspective and our perspective, is the severe shortage, the 140,000. That is one of the core issues around homelessness, particularly economic homelessness, is the massive shortage of housing that we have in the state of Oregon. To your second question, real quick, because I think some of what I'm going to talk about later may also answer your question. To your second question, yes, the answer is yes, but it's not just home ownership, it's also rental housing. So what we have, because we have such a significant housing shortage in the state of Oregon, what you will often find is people not moving into homeownership, which if somebody moves into homeownership, it frees up a rental unit for somebody else to rent. And then you also have people renting in units. It's a strange phenomenon, but people renting in units where they could afford a slightly more expensive unit, a slightly nicer unit, but because of a lack of supply, they will stay in the unit, which then puts pressure on people who have need to get into that more affordable unit. There's natural pricing of individuals and matching to housing units they both desire and can afford. And so it creates both a kind of a supply crunch in terms of people transitioning to homeownership, but also in terms of people moving up and through the rental housing. So definitely that's one of the drivers as well. All right, so. Okay, I'm gonna kind of power through some of this. I think the first thing I'll acknowledge is the governor very early on called for early investment package to address unsheltered homelessness. And I'm not going to go through everything that's on here, but essentially establishing 3 goals and asking for the legislature to appropriate $130 million. The first goal was to open 600 new shelter beds across the state by January 10th of next year. This is under Executive Order 2302, which I'll talk about in a few. The second was to rehouse 1,200 people currently experiencing homelessness. So to get outreach workers out there, identify folks experiencing homelessness, stabilize them, move them into housing. And then the third was to prevent 8,750 households from becoming homeless, which would be through rent assistance and stabilization assistance for these single-time economic events, job loss, healthcare costs, things like that. It was a major priority. She called it an early investment package. For those that are not super familiar with the legislative process, traditionally the legislature appropriates money that will become available to state agencies as of July 1st, and she had asked them to immediately partner with her and make the funds immediately available to start flowing through to communities across the state. Working in partnership with legislative leadership from both parties, she just signed, the legislature passed, and she just signed House Bill 5019. House Bill 5019 not only met the $130 million request, but actually built on it, an acknowledgement that there's more need in Oregon. And so the legislature and the governor have put in place $85 million to rehouse individuals currently experiencing homelessness across the state of Oregon, $33 million to prevent homelessness statewide, $27 million specifically to to rehouse people experiencing homelessness in rural counties, something called the Balance of State Continuum of Care. It's 26 rural counties. And then giving $5 million as a direct allocation to the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. So this is a major priority to start opening up shelter beds, to start rehousing people who are currently experiencing homelessness, and then to prevent new individuals from becoming homeless. So this was signed, I think, last week, and we're in the process of working with the departments to flow this money through communities in order to stand these services up. I think the one thing I also want to mention on this slide, the governor is very committed to outcomes-based spending and has a very strong perspective that all of the appropriations that are being made around housing and homelessness should be geared toward specific outcomes. And that's why you're hearing me emphasize the goal of we need to have 600 shelter beds stood up, 1,200 people rehoused, and then 8,750 people prevent them from becoming homeless. And she has a high expectation for the departments, and she has a high expectation for community partners that are going to be working with the state on this so that we can truly show an impact. And her timeline for the early investment package is next January. So she wants to see all of this done by next January. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I have to go back to slide 1. So that all sounds great, but what is being done about that 68% increase that we've seen over the last 6 years?
If the objectives are successfully met, this should bring us back down to 2017.
And those objectives are?
The rehousing 1,200.
All of this is supposed to take care of that.
Well, it won't address all homelessness, but the driving objective behind determining how much money should be in the early investment package was to try and specifically address the increase that the state has seen in the previous 5 years, and to try and bring those numbers down as quickly as possible.
So I'm kind of piggybacking on this question. So I'm wondering about the other 2 priority areas, and so what's the relationship between the behavioral health objectives and this particular objective, because it seems like they go hand in hand in some cases. Are you having integration with those? Is that like going to address it's stopping the increase of the need? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so we work closely with the Behavioral Health Initiative team, and they are in the process of trying to stand up additional addiction and mental health services around the state. And then where they overlap is something called permanent supportive housing. And it's a kind of highly case-managed housing assistance where individuals who have an addiction issue or a mental health issue and need either light or heavy case management services are placed in the housing where service providers are on site working with the house. So it's like a very intensive form of, it's run by service organizations, it's not a private market housing. And so that's where there is overlap. And so the governor in her budget has recommended significant investments in housing, permanent supportive housing production, and then the funding for addiction and mental health services to pair with the housing units themselves and the people living in the housing. I don't know who was next.
Okay. Go ahead.
Congratulations on your appointment. Question for you. Previous experience, were you with the city of Portland County? Where did she steal you from?
I was at the city of Portland.
Okay, for a similar experience in the coffee care?
Yeah.
Oh, it's on the city on that?
Hmm?
Any comments previously being with the city?
I can't speak.
Right, partnering with
I can't
the
speak on behalf of the city.
Oh,
Any
yeah.
longer, but I appreciate it.
Does the funding flow state to county and city, or does it go direct to city, or both?
Is it a community-specific question? Like,
Yeah, I kind of wonder, because Forest Grove being the size that it is, and some of the meetings I've been at and looking at, how do we get funding for some of these things that we,
Yeah.
we'd like to put into place, we just don't have what Beaverton or Hillsborough has for size or leverage to take, to partake of the funds.
Great question. So, like if this community wanted to get access to research, so I'm going to jump right there. So, her first executive order, even though it's number 2, is 2302, only because there was a natural disaster declaration before she was sworn into office, is around this early investment package, this $130 million ask, charge to the legislature, and the goal of 600 shelter beds, 1,200 people rehoused, and 8,750 people prevented from becoming homeless. She wanted to use a kind of incident command emergency management style response. So not the traditional way that funds flow out for homeless services, but it's an emergency that we need to use the emergency services infrastructure that's in place across the state. And so what that means for like Washington County, for instance, each county that is included in this emergency order, which Washington County is required to stand up. I don't know if we have any emergency response folks in the room. A MAC group, or a multi-agency coordinating group, and it's the county emergency manager, I suppose, or a city emergency manager, but uses the county emergency manager, is convening it with the continuum of care, so there's that county-wide housing and homelessness services entity. And they bring together local government officials and other stakeholders that are wanting to be part of having access to the resources and deciding what services to fund and how to start contracting those services out once funds are available. So there is a MAC group in Washington County, and to the extent you want to be engaged in whatever portion of the $130 million that flows into Washington County, you'll need to engage with that MAC group. So the state provides the funding to the MAC groups. The MAC groups give the plans to the state either approves them or rejects them and asks them to submit it.
There are a lot of private, nonprofit, small groups that are working hard to address these three aspects that we talk about. And one of the big issues they have, of course, is they don't have enough funding to do what they need to do. Is some of this millions you're talking about going to go directly? Do they have to apply for it? Is there a way for them to apply to get that money? How is it distributed to the boots on the ground that are already doing this work but are limited by their amount of cash?
That's another decision that we made by the MAC group. I suspect that most of the people providing the services are nonprofit organizations across the county, and I suspect that I can't say for sure, but I would anticipate that the Washington County MAC group will probably give funding to existing organizations, but potentially new ones as well. So I'll just say from a timing standpoint, I encourage you to find the Washington County MAC group and become a part of that conversation sooner rather than later, because the funds are going to start to flow.
Washington County MAC?
Yes, the I don't have that one all set. It's emergency response. It's a multi-agency coordinating group. And so it's an emergency response framework to the issue of homelessness.
One or two more?
I guess to piggyback off that question there, during the pandemic, there was an emphasis on, before the pandemic, there were homelessness response was not only put on nonprofit groups, but on local churches, especially in the Portland metro area. And during the pandemic, there was a trend of county agencies, I don't know if Metro was involved, but definitely Washington County taking over more of those response efforts from churches, partly as a response to the churches being overwhelmed by needing to provide for homelessness response, whether it was long-term or whether it was in terms of emergency shelters when temperatures got too cold during the winter. In any of this framework that's being provided by the state, is there an incentive for county agencies or multi-county agencies like Metro to take over some of that burden of trying to help house the homeless from the nonprofit agencies and from religious groups?
It's a good question. I don't think there's an incentive that's built in for a county government to provide the services rather than a nonprofit or faith-based organization to provide the services. I certainly think if counties want to, I think it's a great idea, but if some counties prefer to use nonprofits, that's their choice as well, but I don't think that there's an incentive that I can think of. Other than, I know a lot of local government, state and local governments have struggled with a lot of one-time funding lately, and having to plan for services that the funding will go away in 12 months. Part of what is in the budget is that the services will maintain so that you don't have to expect to cut services next year. You'll be able to maintain those shelter beds, keep rehousing people with financial assistance programs, that sort of thing.
Through Rotary, I was able to be part of Tiny Villages for Seattle. And they build these villages through their housing authority. And so, and they're insulated, and they say that they can, over the last 3 years, they've done one tiny house will house 3 people, because the average stay is 120 people. So, just building that one house in that day is hopefully safe to 3 people off the street. On my question for you is this money that's going out, is there accountability to what happens to it? This tiny village has support through, drugs and mental health, and that they have responsibilities. They have to do a 4-hour safety watch every week around their property or around the village. So we're talking about doing that here in Forest Grove. Is there accountability for what goes in and how it's supported? Like this was through the Housing Authority of Seattle, so is there accountability for that money going in?
Yeah, so it kind of sounds similar to the shelters. So the funding for the 600 shelters, new shelter beds, there's some conditions in the funding. One is the safety and habitability of the shelters themselves, so health and safety of the structures, health and safety of the facilities, and then there are, I believe, monthly reporting obligations that the recipient of the funds has to the state, because it's a short timeline. The governor wants to see results by January, and so every recipient of the funds will need to report on a regular basis and demonstrate that their facilities are safe. You cut me off? All right. Let me say one more thing, because I think it's important. Homelessness is a big issue. One thing, hopefully, you can engage on with me at some point, or the governor's office, is another executive order, which I think is important, establish the Housing Production Advisory Council. The Housing Production Advisory Council is made up of the governor, 2 members of the Senate, 2 members of the House, and then 2 agency directors and 18 Oregonians. They all work in the housing development space, so either they're builders, they finance affordable housing, they finance market rate housing, they do permitting, land use planning kind of things. There's 2 objectives that she gave the council. One is to develop a plan framework by the end of March. They've done that. And the second is to bring back a set of recommended actions by the end of this year. And so I'll just mention that it's incredibly important work, because outside of just the crisis and emergency response we have around homelessness, we do have a shortage of housing. They're going to be wrestling with some very tough questions around land availability, the development, design and development standards, the development and permitting process, financing of both regulated affordable housing and market rate housing, and the kinds of programs that some of you have asked about around what direct or indirect incentive programs does the state offer. So it's a council of experts. There's a team of us that are staffing it. We're hoping there'll be some robust discussion and debate with different perspectives, but that by the end of the year, the governor's given us a solid set of recommendations that she can work with the legislature to implement to increase production overall in the state. So, all right, thank you for the one last comment.